Welcome to episode 176 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It is April 25, 1936. Villa Park. Aston Villa against Blackburn Rovers. And the extraordinary thing about this match is that it is not merely a relegation scrap, it is a reckoning with the beginning of league football itself. Because these are not just any two clubs. They are two of the original 12 who accepted William McGregor's league idea in 1888. Two founders, two survivors, two institutions that had been present when English football stopped improvising and started keeping score across a season. And on this day, by the cruel arithmetic of the results around them, both are relegated from the first division. That is the story. Not simply that Villa lose 4-2 at home to Blackburn, but that the last two remaining founder clubs in the top flight fall together. To understand how we got here, you have to go right back to the beginning. When McGregor wrote his famous letter in March 1888, the 12 clubs who became the Football League were Accrington, Aston Villa, Blackburn Rovers, Bolton Wanderers, Burnley, Derby County, Everton, Notts County, Preston North End, Stoke, West Bromwich Albion, and Wolverhampton Wanderers. Villa mattered especially because McGregor was Villa's great administrator, the man who saw that professionalism required fixed fixtures, not chaos. And Villa did not just help invent the league, they quickly became one of its first dynasties. By 1900, Aston Villa had already won 5 league titles. They would add another in 1910. This was one of the giant Victorian clubs, one of the teams that taught England what sustained success looked like. Blackburn's early greatness came in a slightly different register. They were one of the foundational aristocrats of the Cup era, winning the FA Cup 3 seasons in a row in the 1880s, then later becoming league champions in 1912 and 14. So when people in the 1930s looked at Villa and Blackburn, they were not looking at relics, they were looking at old power. But the top flight does not preserve founders out of sentiment. The moment Stoke first dropped out in 1890, the attrition began. By 1893, all 12 founders were together in the top flight for the last time. By 1899, there were 11. Then the old order kept thinning, season by season, decade by decade, as clubs fell away and new ones rose. Some founders came back. Some vanished for long stretches. Accrington disappeared entirely from the league. By the spring of 1936, only 2 of the original 12 were still standing in the first division, Aston Villa and Blackburn Rovers. That is what makes April 25, 1936 so heavy. Now look at the clubs themselves as they entered this season. Villa were not a dying club. They were a great club in decline. In 1931, they had finished runners-up and scored furiously, driven by Tom Pongo Waring. But by the mid-1930s, the structure had softened and the defending had collapsed. Blackburn had their own recent pedigree. They had won the FA Cup in 1928 and were still a serious first division name, but by 1936, they too were leaking away from relevance. Both clubs had history written all over them. Neither had balance. And English football in the 1930s was ruthless with once great teams that stopped functioning. The 1935-36 season did not present a neat relegation line. It was a crush. Going into the last round of fixtures, Sunderland were already champions, which sounds almost impossible when you see their defensive record. 109 goals scored, 74 conceded. That was the age. At the bottom, though, almost everyone was in range of danger. Blackburn were 22nd and bottom on 31 points from 40 matches. Aston Villa were 21st on 35 points from 41 matches. Everton were 20th. West Bromwich were 19th, both also with 35 points, but from 40 matches. Sheffield Wednesday, Grimsby, Liverpool and Wolves all had 37 points. Survival was not a serene mathematical state, it was a street fight. And Villa's own numbers told you the problem. 79 goals scored before this last day, but 106 conceded already. They attacked like a decent side and defended like a broken one. By the time the season ended, Villa had scored 81 and conceded 110. That's 191 goals in 42 league matches. Sunderland, the champions, scored 109 and still let in 74. The whole division was unstable, open, and slightly deranged. And that set up Villa Park. More than 20,000 in the stands. Blackburn came out like a team that knew delay was death. Tommy Sale scored in the 4th minute, Walter Halsall in the 10th, and Ernie Thompson made it 3-0 in the 20th. In other words, By the time most crowds were still settling into the afternoon, Aston Villa were 3-0 down in the match they had to win. Frank Broom did at least score for Villa in the 33rd minute, which gave the game a pulse again. Early in the second half, Eric Houghton scored a penalty to make it 3-2. Villa pressed and pressed. At 3-2 there was still jeopardy, still noise, still a rout back. But Tommy Sale scored again in the 76th minute, and that made it 4-2 to Blackburn. On the day's logic, that was effectively the nail in Villa's coffin. Only, it wasn't enough for Blackburn either, because elsewhere the table was shifting. West Bromwich Albion, playing at Brentford, found a late equaliser to 2-2 through Stan Wood in the 80th minute. That point mattered. It pushed West Bromwich clear enough that the trapdoor opened beneath both Villa and Blackburn together. So the match in Birmingham became one of those terrible football afternoons when both teams lost history at once. Villa lost the game 4-2. Blackburn won the game 4-2, but both were relegated. So what? This was the end of an era, in the most literal possible sense. The Football League had been born with 12 clubs in 1888, and now the final two founder survivors in the top division were gone. The founders did not disappear from football, but the original league order, as a living top-flight reality, had finally expired. Both clubs came back, and quickly enough to matter. Aston Villa won the second division in 1938. Blackburn won it in 1939. So this was not extinction, it was interruption. That is important because the longer story of English football is not one of straight lines, but of recurrence. The pioneers kept reappearing. And the longer arc is where the story becomes beautiful again. Aston Villa has never won the Premier League, but they won the old First Division 7 times, the European Cup in 1982, and the European Super Cup in 82 as well. And now, in April 2026, they are fourth in the Premier League and back in a European semi-final, this time in the Europa League. Blackburn, meanwhile, did something Villa have not done in the modern age. They won the Premier League in 1995, breaking Manchester United's monopoly and giving Jack Walker his impossible dream. So if April 25, 1936 looks like a tombstone, it is not. It is one of those brutal dates that only make sense when you read beyond them. The clubs fall, they return, they change shape, they win again, and history keeps moving through them. And perhaps Villa mattered just a little more in the symbolic sense, because of McGregor. This is the club whose director wrote the letter that invented the league system. The club that helped build the operating system of the modern game. The club that was one of the game's first empires. And yet even that club could be dragged under by a bad team, a bad season, and one bad afternoon in April. That is the league too. It doesn't care who invented it. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 25, 1936. First, this was not only a relegation match, it was the day the last 2 surviving founder clubs from the Football League's original 1888 lineup both fell out of the top flight. Second, the match itself was wild and decisive. Blackburn led 3-0 after 20 minutes. Villa fought back to 3-2. Tommy Sale restored the gap, and Stan Wood's late equaliser for West Brom completed the double doom. And third, the story does not end in the second division. Aston Villa and Blackburn both returned, both won major honours again, and Villa in particular remained one of the clearest living links between football's Victorian invention and its modern elite. On this day in 1936, Aston Villa lost 4-2 at home to Blackburn Rovers, and because of the other results both clubs were relegated together, the last 2 remaining founders of the Football League finally dropping out of the top flight on the same afternoon. That is all for episode 176 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. Tomorrow, go to April 26, 1903, when Athletic Club Bilbao set up a branch in Madrid, and football history took another sharp turn. You don't want to miss it, so please subscribe to the show and share it with all your friends. See you tomorrow.